She gave him 5 years of her life, 5 years of silence, loyalty, and late nights spent under the glow of an office lamp, believing that somewhere behind his cold words, there was a heart that cared. But when Grace Miller walked away from Ethan Cole, the billionaire who never looked up long enough to see her worth, she thought it was over. What she didn't know was that walking away would awaken something he'd buried deep beneath power and pride. Because sometimes, it takes losing the one person who believed in you to realize what truly matters. This is not just a story about love, it's about rediscovery, about a woman who learns her strength the moment she decides to leave, and a man who learns his humanity when he dares to follow. From the rain-soaked streets of New York to the quiet shores of Oregon, the secretary thought he didn't care. But the billionaire couldn't bear seeing her. With Another Man is a journey through heartbreak, redemption, and the timeless truth that love isn't about possession. It's about awakening. Stay with us, because sometimes the most powerful stories begin the moment someone finally decides to walk away. The rain began as a whisper against the windows, then gathered itself into a steady curtain that softened the city into gray. Inside the high-rise, under cool lights that never flickered, Grace Miller gathered her things with the same careful hands that had organized someone else's life for 5 long years. She moved slowly, not because she had more to do, but because motion was the only thing that kept the ache from settling. 34 years old, reliable to a fault, she had mastered the art of leaving a room without leaving a mark. Today, she would try to leave for good. She closed the bottom desk drawer gently, as if closing a chapter, and slipped a small, dog-eared notebook into her tote. No framed photos, no plants to carry through the elevator bank. She had never let roots show in this office. Roots were for people invited to stay. Her nameplate, Grace Miller, Executive Secretary, glinted faintly. She pulled it loose, held it for half a second, then placed it face down. The silence that followed felt respectful. Or maybe that was just the rain. From the corner office, a ghost of her own reflection hovered in the glass, thin and pale around the edges. Ethan Cole's office, tidy, severe, and empty. It had a view. Lord, what a view of a city that bowed to weather and wealth. She had spent years inside that view, pacing the same 12 feet from door to desk, learning the precise weight of his footsteps, the way he cleared his throat before a meeting, the clipped tone that meant he was about to say she'd done well, only he never did, not out loud. She had told herself that was fine. She didn't need praise, she needed purpose, but purpose, when starved of recognition, becomes a quiet kind of hunger. She shrugged on her raincoat, the one with a loose button she never bothered to fix, and lifted her tote. The strap bit into her shoulder with familiar insistence. Outside the glass doors, the corridor looked longer than usual, a corridor for departures. She pressed the elevator button and, for a breath, closed her eyes. It would be easier if I were angry, she thought, easier if I hated him. But anger is loud and temporary. What she felt was softer and harder, to unlearn the heaviness of being unseen by someone she could not help seeing. In the elevator, the mirrored walls made her look like a woman multiplying herself just to leave. She remembered a night a year ago, almost midnight, when the building had been as hushed as a church. She had stayed late again cleaning up after a crisis that wasn't hers. The glow of the screen had made the room feel like an aquarium. Ethan had stood over her shoulder with that calm authority that made other people taller or smaller, depending on the day. She had solved something that saved his morning, maybe his week. He had looked at the monitor, nodded once, and said the line he kept for reliable miracles. "You're just doing your job. Just..." The word had landed like a paperweight on a stack of unspoken things. The elevator opened. The lobby was all marble and echo, a place that made shoes sound decisive. She kept her head down. The security guard, nice man, liked to talk fishing and the best coffee within 3 blocks, lifted a hand and then thought better of it. There was a shape around Grace, a weather of her own making, and people know when to step back from weather. Outside, The rain gave the street a glimmer, like a stage washed clean. She raised her umbrella and stepped into the soft roar. Cabs hissed past. A bus sighed at the curb. She didn't hurry. She wanted the city to register this small subtraction, as if the wet air might say, yes, someone finally let go. This was how she remembered it, now the party, the glitter, the slow motion of a perfect heartbreak. It had been a week ago. The company's annual gala, that lavish ritual designed to reassure the world that everything was not just fine, but sculpted, polished, inevitable. Grace had worn a simple black dress and kept to the edges, collecting stray moments, catching requests mid-air, a missing seating card, a stubborn microphone, a toast delivered without a stumble. She'd seen Ethan across the room, good suit, steady profile, the mask of a man who understood how money looked in photographs. He had that untouchable calm that made the unfamiliar seem manageable. She had admired it. She had organized it. And then the woman striking, public. The kind of beauty that's a headline slipped her arms around his neck in the soft light of a side hallway. It wasn't scandalous. It was too practiced for that. It was the embrace of people who knew the camera's appetite. Grace had watched as one more scene arranged itself around him, as if he were a gravitational field and everyone else was learning to orbit. The moment landed not as shock, but as inevitability. She felt something inside her tilt, like a picture frame finally giving in to a crooked nail. She had gone to the restroom, stared at her reflection under bright, too honest lights, and realized she had been living on crumbs of attention and calling it dinner. The next morning, her resignation letter had taken only 3 sentences. She stuck to facts, kept her feelings in the margins where they usually lived. He hadn't asked why. Now, at the corner, waiting for the walk signal. She felt the familiar pulse of her phone. Old muscle memory made her check it, calendar reminders, messages that lined up like obedient soldiers. Nothing from him. She almost laughed at herself. What would he say? What words were left? Good luck. You'll be fine. He had always been so good at moving forward that you'd think progress was something pinned to his lapel. She crossed on green. The rain found the hem of her skirt, cool against her knees. She thought of the small apartment in a different city, the one she had taken a leap toward with a deposit and a prayer. Portland, a park out front, a kitchen with room for a kettle, and a little radio that played old songs. She could learn the sidewalks by heart. She could memorize the sound of new weather. She could be a person with Saturday mornings again. But endings are never a single door closing. They are a hallway of them. One closed for duty, one for pride, one for the tenderness she tried not to name. She knew she would carry his voice with her, at least for a while, the low constant of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. She knew she would remember the precise angle of his necktie at 9 in the morning, the way he listened with his eyes, the rare warmth that made her believe there was more to him than the public story. People are not their headlines. She had always believed that. Maybe that was why it hurt. A gust of wind tilted her umbrella. She steadied it and kept walking. A bakery window steamed the glass, and for a moment she saw the life she'd forgotten to want coffee warming her hands. A book creased open, nobody needing anything. She could try that. She could learn her own timing, the minute hand and the heart hand, finally in sync. There are women who disappear so quietly you don't notice until the office runs a little rougher, until the day ends a little later. There are women who know the temperature of a room without looking up, who can find a lost document while soothing a frayed ego and solving a puzzle no one else knew was a puzzle. Grace had been that kind of woman. The kind who made success feel inevitable for someone else. She paused under the awning of a pharmacy and listened. Rain, traffic, the low hymn of a city in its evening voice. She took a breath that hurt in a good way. Pain that opens space, she told herself. Out loud this time. You can go. Simple words. They landed where they needed to. A taxi slowed. She shook her head. Not yet. She wanted to walk a little longer. Each step was a small rehearsal for the longer leaving to come, the boxes, the keys, the new address written in neat block letters. She imagined the drive north, miles turning like pages. She imagined a first night in a place that didn't remember her mistakes, a place where the kettle clicked and the window wore rain like a soft shawl. It sounded like mercy. Behind her, the tower that carried his name rose clean and certain. Inside those glass ribs, 1,000 lights were doing what lights do, pretending to be forever. He would be upstairs or on a plane or on the phone that never slept. He would be fine. He always was. The thought hurt and comforted in equal measure. Grace walked on. The city opened, an old friend clearing its throat. Somewhere. A violin found a melody. Somewhere. A door closed without slamming. And somewhere deep inside, in a room she rarely entered, something remained an ember that refused to go cold. Not hope, exactly. Not longing, either. A question. Maybe. A door left slightly ajar. She didn't invite it, she didn't push it away. She tightened her grip on the umbrella, lifted her chin, and let the rain have her for another block. The water tasted clean. She believed, for one steady moment, that leaving was not the opposite of love. It was a way of loving herself, finally, without permission. And yet, when the crosswalk blinked red and she paused again, the faintest picture rose unbidden: the angle of his face when he listened, the almost laugh he offered only in private, the restless focus that could have been tenderness if anyone had asked it to be. She let the picture drift, a leaf in a wide river. She did not chase it. The light turned green. She stepped forward. The city made room. The day she walked away did not announce itself with trumpets or thunder. It moved with her, steady and quiet, like a truth she could live with. She didn't look back, not because there was nothing to see, but because tomorrow needed her eyes. The road stretched north like a long exhale. For the first time in years, Grace Miller wasn't driving toward a deadline, or a meeting, or someone else's expectations. She was simply leaving. The city behind her, the steel, the glass, the hurried rhythm faded into memory, replaced by the quiet ribbon of highway, lined with tall evergreens and mist that hung low like unspoken forgiveness. It rained most of the way to Portland. Maybe that was fitting. Rain had been her companion through endings. Now it would be there for beginnings. She drove with the radio off, listening instead to the hum of tires on wet pavement. Somewhere between the third and fourth hour, she realized she hadn't checked her phone once. The silence felt strange, but not unwelcome, like learning to breathe through new lungs. When she finally reached the city, Portland greeted her not with grand gestures, but with small kindnesses, tree-lined streets glistening after the rain, an elderly man walking his dog under a red umbrella, a cafe window fogged by laughter. Grace found a modest apartment near Laurelhurst Park, 1 bedroom, pale walls, a view of oak trees that looked like they'd seen 1,000 stories. The landlord, a kind woman named Helen, had smiled when Grace handed over the first month's rent. "It's quiet here," she'd said. "You'll like that? Quiet." That was what Grace wanted. Quiet, and a place where her name didn't follow her. She carried her 2 suitcases up 3 flights of stairs, 1 step at a time, her muscles aching in the way that reminds you you're alive. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paint and pine soap. There was a narrow kitchen with a window that framed the park like a painting, and a small table that looked as though it had been waiting for someone to sit down and stay a while. She unpacked slowly. A few blouses, 2 pairs of shoes, her old notebook, the one she used to jot meeting notes, now filled with empty pages that asked gentler questions. When everything was in place, she sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress firm, unfamiliar, and let the silence settle. It was not the heavy silence of the office after midnight. This one felt lighter, like a pause that might become peace. The first few days passed in the rhythm of small, ordinary things. She walked to the corner market for groceries: milk, eggs, coffee beans, and a loaf of honey wheat bread. She learned that the barista downstairs, a young woman named Sophie, always hummed the same tune while making lattes. She discovered the sound of the park at dusk, children's laughter, fading into the chatter of birds. And later, the steady conversation of rain against leaves. Each evening, Grace cooked for herself something simple, something warm. Spaghetti one night, chicken soup the next. She set the table for one, lit a candle anyway. It was the kind of domestic ritual she hadn't known she'd missed. Sometimes, as she washed the dishes, she caught herself looking at the empty chair across from her, imagining someone else there. Then she'd shake her head, smile a little, and turn the radio back on. Healing, she realized, was not a single act. It was a collection of quiet decisions repeated daily. Still, there were moments when the past pressed in, uninvited. On rainy nights Portland had many, she would hear the steady patter against her window and feel herself pulled backward, to that glass tower, that office, that voice. Ethan's voice. It would come to her in fragments, the low tone of command, the measured patience that made others listen, the faint trace of weariness he tried to hide. She would see the way he looked through people, not at them, and remember that once. She had been part of that crowd he looked past. Sometimes she wondered if he noticed her absence. Did he glance at the empty desk, or had someone already filled it? Did he even realize she'd taken the blue mug with the small crack near the rim, the one she always used for his coffee? It was easier to believe he didn't. Easier to pretend she had been just another efficient name in his contact list. But pretending didn't erase the ache. One evening, after a week of job searching and carefully avoiding memories, Grace sat at her small desk by the window, typing another cover letter. Her laptop cast a soft glow on her face. And outside, the park lamps flickered on, one by one. She felt calm, tired, but calm. Then the email arrived. The subject line was ordinary enough inquiry regarding financial documentation. She almost deleted it, assuming it was junk, but curiosity made her open it. The message was from a law firm in New York. The words were polite, clinical, but they pulled the air from the room. Dear Ms. Miller, your name has appeared in reference to several internal financial documents currently under legal review regarding coal industries. We would appreciate your cooperation in clarifying your involvement. Her hands froze over the keyboard. For a full minute, she didn't move. The only sound was the faint tick of the wall clock and the rain outside, steady, patient, indifferent. Coal industries. Ethan's empire. Her first thought was disbelief. She had always handled paperwork. Yes, but never money. Never anything that crossed ethical lines. She was careful, meticulous, loyal, still. The words echoed. Your name has appeared. Grace reread the email, her pulse quickening. She tried to remember everything she had signed, everything she had filed. There were hundreds of documents, thousands of signatures. It was possible, wasn't it, that her name had been attached to something she didn't understand at the time? She swallowed hard. Was I just another pawn in his game? The question slipped out before she could stop it, soft and trembling in the quiet room. It wasn't bitterness that filled her. It was confusion and a slow, spreading fear. Had Ethan known? Had he used her trust, her competence, as a shield? Or was this some cruel twist of circumstance, dragging her back into the world she had fought to leave behind? The rain outside grew heavier, as if answering her thoughts. Grace closed the laptop and pressed her palms together, grounding herself in the solidness of the table beneath her. She looked around the apartment, the walls, the lamplight, the books stacked neatly on the shelf. For a moment, she wondered if she should pack again, start over somewhere even farther away. But running had already taken her here. She wasn't sure there was any farther to go. Instead, she stood and walked to the window. The park below was empty now, its paths shining under streetlights. She watched the rain blur the outlines of the world until nothing was sharp anymore, not the trees, not the benches, not the future. She breathed in slowly, counted to 3, then whispered, "No, not again." She had built this new life one quiet choice at a time. Whatever storm was coming, she would face it this time not as someone's secretary, but as her own witness. Still, deep down, A question lingered, like thunder behind the clouds. If Ethan Cole was in trouble, why did part of her heart still hope he would find her? The rain didn't answer. It only fell gentle, relentless, eternal, like memory itself. That night, Grace barely slept. The rain had stopped, but its rhythm stayed inside her, an echo in her chest that refused to quiet down. The email from the law firm looped through her mind like a song she didn't want to remember. Each time she closed her eyes, the same words returned. Your name has appeared in reference to internal financial documents. Morning came gray and restless. She brewed a pot of coffee that went cold before she could finish half a cup. The park outside her window shimmered with dew. Joggers passed, dogs barked. The world moved on as if her life hadn't just cracked open. She told herself it was probably a mistake, a line on a spreadsheet, an automated message, but doubt is a quiet guest that doesn't leave once invited. By noon, Grace decided she couldn't sit and wonder anymore. She found the number of the law firm in the email signature and called. Her voice wavered slightly when she introduced herself, but the assistant on the other end sounded kind. Mr. Ward will see you at 3, the woman said. He mentioned your name. Daniel Ward's office was on the east side of downtown, tucked inside a brick building that used to be a bank. The waiting room smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish. Grace sat with her hands clasped, watching the second hand of a clock sweep in steady circles. She tried not to imagine what kind of trouble could reach her all the way from New York. When the office door opened, the man who stepped out wasn't what she expected. He was young 30, maybe sharp suit, sleeves rolled once at the wrist. His handshake was firm, his smile disarming. Miss Miller, he said, motioning her inside. Thank you for coming on such short notice. She followed him to a small conference room lined with file boxes. He offered her water, which she declined, then took a seat across the table. For a moment, neither spoke. Daniel opened a folder, flipped through several pages, and finally looked up. His eyes were steady, professional, but softened by a trace of sympathy. I'll get straight to the point, he said. You worked for Ethan Cole for 5 years, correct? Grace nodded. Yes, I was his executive secretary. Daniel hesitated, as though measuring his words. Mr. Cole is currently under federal investigation. Stock manipulation, possible insider trading. Nothing proven yet, but the inquiry is widening. Grace blinked, her mind struggling to keep up. Ethan, she repeated quietly, as if saying the name might summon him. That can't be right. He was careful, obsessively careful. Daniel slid a document across the table. Your signature appears here, he said gently. And here. Both correspond to transactions now being reviewed. Grace leaned forward. The pages were dense with numbers and legal jargon, but her own name stood out in neat black print. Grace Miller, executive assistant. She felt her breath catch. Those were standard approvals. She whispered, internal transfers. He said they were routine. I believe you, Daniel said, but others might not. Right now, your name is on record, which means you could be questioned or worse, blamed. He paused, his voice lowering. Someone may come after you. Miss Miller, you were his closest assistant. The words hit like cold water. For a long moment, Grace stared at the paper, the ink blurring as her vision clouded. Then she leaned back, folded her arms tightly, and shook her head. No, she said. He wouldn't do that. He's arrogant, yes, detached, but dishonest. No. Ethan doesn't need to cheat to win. Daniel studied her face, perhaps recognizing that her defense came not from logic, but from something more fragile. People do strange things when they have everything to lose, he said quietly. If I were you, I'd stay alert. Don't talk to anyone who contacts you about this without legal counsel. He handed her his card. Call me if anything feels off, even a wrong number, or a car parked too long outside your place. Grace took the card with trembling fingers. The embossed letters read, Daniel Ward, attorney at law. Beneath it, a simple tagline, Truth Matters. As she left the office, The afternoon light had shifted a dull, golden haze that made everything look uncertain. She walked for several blocks before realizing she'd been clutching the business card so tightly it had bent in her hand. She slipped it into her pocket and breathed deeply, trying to steady herself. The city felt different now, as if every shadow carried a whisper. Back in her apartment, she closed the blinds and sat by the window, her reflection faint in the glass. "Stock manipulation," she murmured. The words didn't sound real. Ethan's world had always been built on precision, control, and power. To imagine it cracking apart was like picturing marble turning to dust. Still, a quiet thought crept in. Maybe that's what happens when you build too high. Across the country, in the glittering skyline of New York, Ethan Cole stood in front of a window of his own. From the top floor of Cole Industries, the city unfolded beneath him like a living map, cars glinting, rivers pulsing with light. But none of it reached him. He'd read the morning report an hour ago. Grace Miller resigned abruptly, no forwarding address. For 5 years, she had been the steady pulse behind his empire, the one who remembered what he forgot, who anticipated what he hadn't yet asked for. Now, her absence echoed through the office like a missing heartbeat. He had told himself it didn't matter. People leave, assistants move on. But each time he glanced at her empty desk, something inside him twisted a feeling too raw to name. When Victor Hale, his former partner, had walked into his office earlier that day with a thin smile and sharper questions, Ethan had barely listened. "You seem distracted," Victor had said. "Everything all right?" Ethan's reply had been a clipped, "Everything's fine," but the words rang hollow, even to him. Now, as night descended over Manhattan, he stood alone with a glass of scotch he hadn't touched. His reflection in the window looked older, harder, below. The streets pulsed with motion, unaware of the war quietly unfolding in the towers above them. He turned the glass in his hand, watching the light fracture through amber liquid. "Why does it feel," he whispered to no one, "like I lost something that mattered?" The question lingered in the room, unanswered, floating between glass and steel and memory. Behind him, the phone buzzed a notification from his legal team, another crisis demanding attention. He ignored it. For once, numbers and strategy meant nothing. What haunted him wasn't the possibility of scandal, or money, or power slipping through his grasp. It was the echo of her footsteps fading down a hallway, the quiet sound of someone leaving without slamming the door. Ethan set the glass down carefully. Somewhere beneath the armor of ambition, he felt the faint, unfamiliar ache of regret. And in a small apartment in Portland, as the first drops of evening rain began to fall again, Grace felt the same ache, distant, unexplainable, like a thread pulled taut between two lives that refused to fully let go. Days turned into weeks, but peace still refused to settle inside Grace Miller. After her meeting with Daniel Ward, every phone ring made her heart jump. Every knock at the door felt like an alarm. She tried to drown the worry in routine morning walks through the park, fresh coffee at sunrise, soft music in the evenings, but unease had its own rhythm. It pulsed quietly, waiting for her to stop long enough to hear it, to distract herself. She took a part-time job at a small cafe on the corner of Belmont Street, a warm, wood-paneled place that smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon. The owner, Mrs. Lane, was kind and didn't ask too many questions. Grace liked that. She found comfort in the smallness of her tasks, wiping tables, steaming milk, scribbling customers' names in careful handwriting on paper cups. Here, no one knew she had once scheduled flights for billionaires or drafted contracts worth millions. Here, she was just Grace. Each day ended the same way she'd walk home under Portland's gentle drizzle, the night soft against her skin, the world quiet enough for her to almost believe she was safe. Almost. Then one Thursday evening, fate, always patient, always precise, came calling. It was late, close to closing time. Only a few customers lingered, typing on laptops or reading under the golden light. Grace was behind the counter, humming quietly as she cleaned the espresso machine. The bell above the door chimed, and a gust of cool night air followed someone inside. She didn't look up right away. "We're about to close," she said politely, without turning. The silence that followed made her pause. Then, a voice she knew too well, low, controlled, familiar in a way that made her forget to breathe. "I won't be long." Her hands froze around the cloth she was holding. For a heartbeat, the cafe seemed to stop the music, the hum of the fridge, even the clock. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. There he was, Ethan Cole. He stood just inside the door, tall, composed, wrapped in an expensive gray coat that didn't quite belong in this modest little cafe. The city's rain glistened on his shoulders, his hair slightly damp, but his eyes, those steady, unreadable eyes, found her instantly, as if he'd known exactly where she would be. Grace's pulse stuttered. She wanted to speak, to move, to do something, but all she managed was a whisper. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, as if approaching something fragile. "I needed to see you," he said. Her instinct was to step back, to put distance between them. The counter felt like a thin wall between two worlds. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. "You have your own mess to handle." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "So, you've heard." "Everyone's heard," she replied, her tone sharper than she intended. "Even here, rumors travel fast." For a moment, he didn't answer. His gaze dropped to the floor, then back to her. "Grace," he said quietly, "why did you leave without saying a word?" Her laugh was small and bitter. "You mean after 5 years of silence from you, I figured we were even." He exhaled, the sound closer to a sigh than a breath. "You think I didn't notice that I didn't." He stopped himself, the words tightening in his throat. "You shouldn't have left like that." The air between them felt heavy, charged. Grace leaned forward slightly, her voice trembling but steady enough to wound. "Maybe you should have cared before I did." He flinched just barely, but she saw it, that tiny fracture in the armor he wore so well. Behind them, a customer slipped out quietly, leaving the two of them alone. Rain tapped gently against the windows, a soft percussion for a conversation 5 years overdue. Ethan's eyes lingered on her face, tracing the quiet strength she carried now. "You've changed," he said, almost to himself. Grace crossed her arms, a fragile shield. "No, Ethan, I just stopped trying to prove I was worth seeing." He looked down, the corners of his mouth tightening. "You were always worth seeing," he murmured. "I just didn't know how to look." The words reached her, and for a fleeting second, the ache inside her softened. But then reason returned, quick and cold. "If you came here to fix your guilt, don't," she said. "Whatever's happening in your world, it's not mine anymore." He nodded slowly, accepting the hit. "You're right." He straightened his coat, the motion, precise, practiced. "Still, I had to make sure you were all right." Her brows furrowed. "How did you even find me?" His gaze flicked toward the window. "When someone disappears, it leaves a gap. I just followed the quiet." The answer unnerved her, not because it sounded rehearsed, but because it didn't. For the first time, she saw something unguarded in him, something close to loneliness. She swallowed, unsure what to say. Finally, she stepped back and reached for the rag she'd dropped earlier. "You should go, Ethan, before someone recognizes you. Portland isn't your kind of place." He hesitated. For a moment, it seemed he might say something else, something real, but instead, he only nodded. "Take care of yourself, Grace." She forced a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I've been doing that for a while now." He turned to leave, hand on the door, then paused. Without looking back, he said quietly, "You shouldn't have left like that." Her reply came after a breath that trembled in the air. "Maybe you should have cared before I did." The bell above the door rang softly as he stepped into the night. Grace stood still, her reflection faint in the cafe window. Outside, the rain had started again, tracing thin rivers down the glass. She pressed her palm to the cool surface, feeling the ache return, not sharp, but deep, like a bruise that memory kept touching. Across town, Ethan walked alone beneath the streetlights, his thoughts louder than the rain. Every word she'd said echoed back at him, clean and merciless. He had faced investors, reporters, and rivals with steady confidence, but Grace's quiet truth had undone him in ways he couldn't name. That night, neither of them slept. Grace lay awake listening to the rain against her window, his voice looping softly in her head. Ethan stared out from his hotel room, city lights blurred beyond the glass. Somewhere between regret and longing, they both reached the same realization. The story between them wasn't finished. It had simply been paused, waiting for courage to turn the page. The night after Ethan walked out of the cafe, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something quiet but irreversible. His sudden appearance had reopened a door she'd tried hard to close, and though she told herself it was over, her heart knew better. Some connections, once made, keep echoing through the silence long after words are gone. Days passed. Portland's winter came early that year, soft gray mornings and the faint smell of rain that never seemed to leave the air. Grace threw herself into work, grateful for the distraction. The cafe was busier now, filled with the hum of conversation and the comfort of routine. But whenever the doorbell chimed, she couldn't help glancing up, half expecting him to walk through again, half dreading it. It was on a Thursday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks later, when her phone rang. She recognized Daniel Ward's number immediately. Her stomach tightened. She stepped into the narrow alley behind the cafe, pulling her coat tighter against the wind before answering. "Grace." Daniel's voice was calm but urgent. "I need to see you. Today. If possible." "Did something happen?" she asked, heart picking up. "Yes," he said, "and you're not going to like it." An hour later, they sat across from each other in his small, paper-stacked office. Daniel looked more tired than she remembered, shadows under his eyes, sleeves rolled up as if he'd been fighting fires all day. He didn't waste time. "Someone's trying to pin parts of the coal investigation on you," he said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Documents have surfaced, emails, internal memos, all altered to make it look like you were aware of certain financial transfers." Grace stared at the folder as though it might bite. "Altered by who?" "That's what we're trying to find out," Daniel said. "But whoever's behind it is good. The forgeries are convincing enough to raise suspicion. If the authorities buy it, you could be named as an accomplice." Her breath caught. "An accomplice." Daniel nodded. "Ethan Cole's personal assistant. It's a convenient narrative. Grace, you had access, proximity, and plausible deniability. Whoever's orchestrating this knows how the system thinks." Grace leaned back, pressing a hand to her forehead. "This can't be happening. I left that world to stay out of its shadows, and now they're following me." Daniel's tone softened. "Listen to me. I don't believe you're guilty of anything, but we have to be careful. Don't respond to any inquiries. Don't share personal information online. And if anyone contacts you claiming to represent coal industries, call me first." Grace nodded slowly, her mind spinning. "Do you think Ethan knows?" Daniel hesitated. "If he doesn't yet, he will soon. I suspect he's already investigating, and indeed, he was across the country, in a sleek penthouse above New York's skyline." Ethan Cole stood in front of his desk, the city reflected in the glass behind him. He had just hung up a call with his legal team, his jaw tight. Someone was moving against him and against Grace. The idea that she was being dragged into the chaos because of him filled him with a rare kind of anger, the quiet, precise kind that burns cold instead of hot. He turned to his chief of security, a grizzled man named Harris. "Find out who's behind this," Ethan said, his voice low. "Every lead, every file. Start with Victor Hale." Harris frowned. "You think it's Hale?" Ethan's expression hardened. "He's the only one with both motive and access. He's been waiting for an opportunity to take me down since the day I forced him out of the board." "And Miss Miller?" Harris asked carefully. Ethan paused, his hands tightening at his sides. "She's not to be touched," he said quietly. "If anyone comes near her, I want to know before they take a single step." Back in Portland, Grace tried to go on with her life, though the edges of her calm had begun to fray. Every knock at the door startled her now. Every unknown number on her phone made her chest tighten. At night, she sat by the window, watching the lights in the park flicker through the mist. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry over Ethan again, wouldn't let his world seep into hers. But fear has a way of undoing resolve. She thought of what Daniel had said, "Someone may come after you," and of how Ethan had looked that night in the cafe, weary but still carrying that quiet intensity that once drew her in. She wanted to hate him for bringing this into her life, but the truth was more complicated. Somewhere deep down, she still believed he hadn't meant for any of it to happen. The rain began again, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the glass. Grace wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, her laptop open on the table. She tried to lose herself in the steady rhythm of typing, replying to job applications, anything to feel normal. That's when her phone buzzed. It was nearly midnight. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. She frowned, unlocking it. Only 2 words appeared on the screen. "You're next." For a moment, her mind refused to process what she was seeing. Then her pulse surged. She stood abruptly, knocking over her coffee cup. The sound shattered the quiet, echoing off the walls. Her first instinct was to call Daniel, but what if it was nothing? A prank? Her trembling hands said otherwise. The message had no link, no context, just those 2 words. She looked toward the window, the night outside impossibly dark. Her reflection in the glass stared back, pale and afraid. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, fading into silence. Grace picked up her phone again, reading the message over and over until the words blurred. She deleted it, but the dread stayed. In another city, at that same hour. Ethan stood alone on his balcony, wind tugging at his coat. His investigation was closing in, but the cost of the truth was beginning to feel heavier than he'd expected. He took out his phone, hesitated, then typed a message that he never sent. "Are you safe?" He watched the cursor blink, then erased the words. Some things, he told himself, were better left unsaid, but the night had its own plans. And somewhere between Portland's quiet rain and New York's sleepless skyline, 2 lives once intertwined, now walking parallel through danger, were being drawn back together by something neither of them could yet name. The storm had only just begun to whisper. That night, the rain refused to stop. It came down in silver threads against Grace's window, steady and relentless, like the rhythm of her heartbeat. She sat curled on the couch, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, trying to convince herself that the message had meant nothing. "You're next." 2 words, no sender, no context. But fear doesn't need context. It only needs imagination. She had tried to sleep, but every shadow on the wall felt like a movement. Every creak in the old apartment sounded like footsteps in the hall. By dawn, exhaustion had finally won. She drifted into a fitful sleep, the phone still clutched in her hand. When morning came, Portland wore its usual gray coat of clouds. Grace forced herself through another day, convincing herself it had all been paranoia. People sent strange messages all the time, wrong numbers, mischief, coincidence. But deep down, she knew better. By evening, the city had darkened again under low clouds. The cafe was quiet, only a handful of customers staying late to avoid the drizzle. Grace finished wiping down the tables and waved goodbye to Mrs. Lane before stepping outside. The air smelled of rain and streetlights. She pulled her hood up and started the familiar walk home, 2 blocks through the park, 1 turn past the bookstore, then home. But that night, the streets felt different. The wind carried no sound. Even the rain seemed to hush. She tightened her grip on her bag and walked faster. The lamps flickered, their light breaking across puddles. A black sedan sat idling at the far end of the block, its headlights dimmed. She noticed it only when she passed the bookstore. A twinge of unease brushed her spine. Don't be ridiculous, she told herself. It's just someone waiting for a ride. Still, she crossed to the other side of the street. Her shoes splashed through shallow puddles as she turned the corner toward her apartment building. That's when she heard it, a car door closing, soft but unmistakable. Grace turned. Two men stepped out of the shadows, one tall, one broad, both dressed in black. No words, no warning. Panic hit before logic could. She ran. The first man caught her by the arm. She twisted free, her bag falling to the ground. "Let me go," she shouted, her voice echoing off the wet pavement. A hand covered her mouth. The smell of leather and gasoline filled her nose. Her feet kicked, heels scraping the concrete. Then darkness. Miles away, in New York. Ethan Cole stood in his office, his reflection sharp against the window glass. His phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it until he saw the message preview. "It's about Grace." He answered instantly. Who is this A-man's voice? Breathless and tense. "Mr. Cole. This is Daniel Ward. I don't know how else to reach you. Grace Miller's missing." Ethan froze. "What do you mean, missing?" "She was taken," Daniel said, the words tumbling out. Witnesses saw two men force her into a car outside her apartment about an hour ago. Police are looking, but the sound that followed wasn't quite human. It was the sharp inhale of a man used to control, losing it. Ethan's hand gripped the phone so tightly it creaked. "Send me everything you know," he said, his voice low, dangerous. Now. Within minutes, he was moving, grabbing his keys, barking orders into another phone. "Harris, assemble the team. I want eyes on every camera between Portland and the interstate. Charter the jet. I'm leaving within the hour." He didn't stop to think about how reckless it sounded. For years, Ethan had built an empire by mastering risk. But this wasn't business. This was something raw, something older. By the time he reached the private airstrip, the storm had grown fierce. Sheets of rain lashed against the runway lights. He didn't care. As the jet lifted into the black sky, Ethan stared out the window, every mile tightening the coil in his chest. He had failed her once. He wouldn't again. When Grace woke, the air was cold and smelled of rust. Her wrists were bound, her head throbbing. A single bulb swung from the ceiling, casting thin slices of light across a concrete floor. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily. She tried to move. Rope scraped her skin. Panic surged again, hot and dizzying. Then she heard its footsteps, slow, unhurried. A voice followed, smooth and cruelly calm. "You were supposed to stay quiet, Miss Miller." Grace's head jerked up. The man stepped into the light. Victor Hale. She recognized him instantly from company events. Ethan's former partner, the one with the expensive smile and colder eyes. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "Why are you doing this?" Victor tilted his head. "Because your boss decided to ruin me. And since he seems to care about you more than I expected, you're useful." Grace shook her head, her pulse pounding. "You don't understand. I don't know anything." "Oh, but you do," Victor said softly. "You were at his side for 5 years. You know his habits, his weaknesses. And now that the authorities think you're part of his little financial scandal, well," he smiled thinly, "you're the perfect pawn." She tried to pull away from the ropes, voice trembling. "Ethan will find me." Victor laughed, low and sharp. "That's exactly what I want." He leaned closer, his breath cold against her cheek. "You see, Miss Miller, sometimes the best way to destroy a man isn't to take his money. It's to take what he can't afford to lose." Outside, the rain hammered the roof like an angry clock, counting down to something inevitable. And hundreds of miles away, in the dark cabin of a jet slicing through the storm, Ethan Cole stared into the night, his jaw set, his hands clenched. Every instinct told him this wasn't just business revenge, it was personal. He whispered to no one, "Hold on, Grace." Below, Lightning flashed across the clouds, painting the sky in brief, violent bursts of light. Somewhere in that storm, two paths were racing toward collision, one driven by vengeance, the other by love, still learning how to speak its name. The night had never been quieter, and yet, the storm had never been louder. The night stretched long and merciless over the Oregon countryside. A storm gathered above the pines, sweeping sheets of rain across the back roads and shadowed fields. Inside that darkness, Ethan Cole's car tore through the wet asphalt, headlights slicing the fog. Every mile narrowed his world down to one thought: find her. He had landed barely an hour ago. By the time the plane's wheels touched the ground, Harris had already sent coordinates from the last trace of Grace's phone. A signal pinged on the outskirts of the city before it vanished completely. An old industrial area, warehouses, too many places to hide someone. "Send me everything," Ethan had ordered, his voice low, tight. "Yes, sir. But go in with backup," Harris had urged. "I'm not waiting," Ethan replied. "If they wanted to hurt me, they chose the wrong way to do it. Now." The car jolted over a rough patch of gravel. He slowed, headlights sweeping across a line of abandoned storage buildings, gray concrete, rusted doors, roofs sagging under rain. The last signal had come from here. He killed the engine, stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him instantly, slicing through his coat. He didn't care. Behind him, two of his security men followed, weapons drawn, eyes sharp. "She's inside that one of them said, pointing toward the largest warehouse. Thermals picking up 3 figures. Ethan nodded, his heart hammered against his ribs, steady and brutal. He had faced corporate takeovers, media storms, betrayal, but this was different. This was personal. "Wait for my signal," he said. Then he moved, inside the warehouse. Grace sat slumped against a pillar, her wrists raw from the ropes. The air smelled of oil and rain-soaked wood. Somewhere behind her, Victor Hale's voice cut through the dark, calm and measured. "She'll make him come," he said to someone unseen, "and when he does, we'll finish this." Grace tried to steady her breathing. Her pulse felt too loud, like it might give her away. Every sound, the creak of the roof, the footsteps, the hum of distant thunder fed her fear. But beneath that fear, a spark of defiance burned low and stubborn. "Ethan will come," and he did. A flash of movement. The heavy door groaned open, then silence. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the first guard fell, his body crumpling before he could shout. A second followed, swift, precise. The sound of a gun clattering against concrete echoed in the vast, empty space. Grace's eyes widened, her breath caught. She knew that silhouette even in the half-light. Ethan. He stepped into the glow of the swinging bulb, rain dripping from his hair, eyes locked on Victor. His voice was calm, cold. "Let her go." Victor turned, slow and deliberate, a faint smile curving his lips. "I was wondering when the great Ethan Cole would arrive. You're predictable." You know that Ethan didn't answer. He took another step forward. One of Victor's men moved to block him, and Ethan's fist met the man's jaw before he finished raising his weapon. The second man lunged. A scuffle followed, brutal, fast, echoing in the cavernous space. Grace watched through tears and chaos, her heart split between terror and disbelief. The man who once lived behind glass towers was now bleeding in a dark warehouse for her. When the last of Victor's men hit the floor, silence fell again. Ethan's breath came rough, uneven. A shallow cut streaked across his temple, blood mixing with rain. Victor stepped backward, toward a side door. "You're too late." "Ethan," he hissed, "you can't win this." Ethan raised the gun he'd taken from one of the guards. "Maybe not," he said, voice steady. "But you don't get to touch her again." For a second, their eyes locked, the kind of silent standoff that only ends one way. But before Victor could reach for his own weapon, Ethan fired. The bullet struck the doorframe inches from Victor's hand. The man flinched, cursed, and fled into the storm. Ethan didn't chase him. He dropped the gun, turned toward Grace, and crossed the distance in seconds. She looked up as he knelt beside her. "You came," she whispered. He reached for the ropes, his hands shaking slightly. "Of course I did." When the knots finally gave, she collapsed into his arms, weak, trembling, but alive. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the storm outside, fierce and endless. "Can you walk?" he asked softly. She nodded. He slipped an arm around her shoulders, steadying her as they moved toward the exit. Outside, rain poured down in silver sheets. They reached his car, headlights still glowing faintly through the mist. He helped her inside, then turned back to make sure no one followed. Half an hour later, they found refuge in an old cabin off the highway, an emergency hideout his team had secured years ago. The place was small, tucked deep in the woods, the kind of place where the world could forget you existed. Inside, the air was cold and damp. Ethan built a fire in the stone hearth while Grace sat on the couch, a blanket draped over her shoulders. Her skin was pale, her eyes distant. When the flames finally caught, light flickered across the walls, soft, golden, almost kind. Ethan turned to her. "You should rest," he said. Grace shook her head. "I can't. Not yet." He knelt in front of her, his movements careful, deliberate. He took her hands, inspecting the rope burns, wincing at the marks. "I'm sorry," he murmured, "for what she asked, her voice small, for not protecting you, for every time I made you feel like you didn't matter." Grace's eyes filled. "Why now? Ethan, why come for me?" He looked up, his expression unguarded for the first time. "Because I thought losing you would hurt less if I pretended I didn't care." He paused, his voice breaking on the next words. "I was wrong." The fire crackled softly between them. Outside, rain whispered against the roof, steady and tender now, as if the storm itself had decided to rest. For a long while, they said nothing. The silence between them was no longer the heavy silence of strangers. It was the fragile quiet of two people learning how to breathe in the same space again. Grace reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. "You're bleeding," she said gently. He glanced at his temple and smiled faintly. "Just a scratch. Nothing that matters." But it did matter to her. She stood, retrieved a first aid kit from the cabinet, and began cleaning the wound with trembling hands. He winced once, but didn't pull away. When she finished, he caught her wrist lightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe now." She met his eyes, tired, kind, utterly sincere. For the first time, she saw him not as her boss, or the billionaire behind the empire, but as a man flawed, scared, human. Outside, the wind softened, the forest sighed, the night, once filled with danger, now held only the sound of breathing steady, fragile, alive, and somewhere between the crackle of the fire and the beating of their hearts, Grace realized the truth: the storm hadn't ended. It had simply changed shape, but this time, they would face it together. Outside, the rain kept whispering against the roof, soft and unending like the world's quiet sigh after a long-held breath. Inside the small cabin, the fire had grown steady, its glow painting the walls in amber light. Grace sat near the hearth, wrapped in a wool blanket, her hair still damp, her face pale but calm. Across from her, Ethan sat on the floor beside the couch, his shirt sleeve torn where the knife had grazed him. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It was the kind that happens when words have already done all they can. Grace broke it first. Her voice was gentle, almost hesitant. "You should let me clean that cut." Ethan looked up, his expression softening. "It's nothing." She gave a small, tired smile. "You said that the last time. Remember? In the office, when you burned your hand on the coffee maker and pretended it didn't hurt." He blinked, surprised by the memory. "You remember that I remember everything," she said quietly. Then she rose and reached for the small first aid kit on the table. He didn't argue. He let her sit beside him, the warmth from the fire brushing their skin. When she dabbed the antiseptic on his wound, he winced slightly, and she murmured an apology. Their hands brushed once, and for a moment neither moved. "You saved my life," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "No, I'm just trying to fix what I broke." Grace tied the bandage carefully, her fingers steady. "You didn't break me, Ethan. You just stopped seeing me." The words hung between them, honest, quiet, and devastating. He looked at her then. Really looked. Not the way a boss looks at an employee, but the way a man looks at the person he's been trying not to miss. The firelight flickered across her face, tracing the exhaustion, the strength, the softness. "I saw you," he said finally. "Every day. I just didn't know how to let myself feel it." Grace's eyes lowered. "That's not seeing, Ethan. That's surviving." For a while, the only sound was the pop and hiss of the fire. Outside, the storm began to fade, the rain thinning to a gentle patter. Ethan leaned back against the couch, exhaling. "When you left," he said, "I told myself it didn't matter, that I could replace you, like I replaced everyone who ever walked away. But it wasn't true. The office felt empty. Even the air." Grace stared into the flames. "I didn't want to leave angry. I just couldn't stay invisible anymore." He nodded slowly. "You weren't invisible, Grace. You were the one thing I couldn't stop depending on. Depending on isn't the same as caring." She whispered. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached for a small towel, dampened it, and began to clean the bruises on her wrist where the ropes had burned her skin. His touch was careful, reverent almost, as if afraid she might vanish if he wasn't gentle enough. "You shouldn't have had to go through that," he said. Grace's lips trembled, but she kept her voice steady. "It's not the first time I've been scared, Ethan, just the first time I didn't have to face it alone." He glanced up at her. "You're stronger than anyone I know." She smiled faintly. "Strong doesn't mean unbreakable." Something in his chest shifted then, an ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel. He set the towel aside, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "When I was a kid," he began slowly, "my father used to say that love was a distraction, that it made men weak. I guess I believed him. I built everything I have by keeping people at a distance. But when I saw that warehouse door close behind you," his voice broke slightly, "it was the first time I realized what real weakness feels like." Grace listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She had never heard him speak this way, not to her, not to anyone. She turned toward him. "Maybe it's not weakness," she said softly. "Maybe it's just being human." He smiled, a small, tired smile. "I'm still learning how to be that." They both fell silent again. The firelight shimmered between them, like a fragile thread connecting two people who had lived too long behind walls. After a while, Grace leaned back, resting her head against the couch. "When I worked for you," she said, "I used to be afraid of fading into the background. Every time you walked into a room, the air changed. People noticed you, listened, but me, I was just the quiet one in the corner, the one holding it all together while no one looked." He turned to her. "You were never background, Grace. You were the reason everything worked." Her eyes glistened. "Then why did it take losing me for you to say that he opened his mouth, then closed it again? The truth was simple, and it hurt, because I didn't know how to deserve you." The words settled into the room like a confession. The fire crackled softly, throwing sparks that disappeared before they touched the floor. Grace watched them rise and fade, her thoughts moving slower now, like the rhythm of the rain. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the tremor of uncertainty underneath. Ethan looked at her, the lines of fatigue etched deep into his face. "Then, let me earn it," he said quietly. "Not with words, but with what I do next." She studied him for a long moment, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. There was no promise of forgiveness, No grand declaration, only the fragile honesty of two people standing in the aftermath of their mistakes. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The forest was silent except for the slow drip of water from the eaves. Inside, the cabin seemed to exhale with them, as if it too had been holding its breath. Grace pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and leaned toward the fire. Ethan watched her, then reached forward to place another log on the flames. The sparks leapt up again, briefly lighting the curve of her face, the faint smile that touched her lips before fading into thought. They stayed like that for a long time, two people surrounded by quiet, not yet healed, but no longer alone. The night didn't feel endless anymore. It felt like the start of something fragile and real. And as the last of the storm clouds drifted past the cabin, the world outside seemed to whisper the same truth they both already knew: some wounds aren't meant to disappear. They're meant to remind us how close light can live beside the dark. By the time the first morning light touched the cabin, the storm had passed. The forest stood still, washed clean, its silence carrying a strange kind of grace. Grace Miller sat by the window, watching sunlight filter through the mist. For the first time in weeks, she felt warmth not from the fire, but from something steadier, something alive. Ethan was outside, speaking quietly on the phone, his voice calm but clipped. She could tell by the way his shoulders squared that he was making a decision, a real one, the kind that changes everything. When he stepped back inside, his eyes met hers. "It's time to go home," he said. The word home startled her. She wasn't sure which place he meant, his empire of glass and steel, or something smaller, something closer to this cabin where honesty finally lived between them. "Still?" She nodded. "Back to New York." "Yes." His tone was steady, almost too steady. "Victor's not finished. If we run, he wins. The only way out is through." Grace hesitated. "Ethan, if you go back, they'll come after you again. And after me." He crossed the room, stopping just in front of her. "They already have," he said quietly. "But this time, I'm not fighting to protect a company. I'm fighting to protect the truth." 2 days later, the private jet descended through a gray curtain of clouds, landing on the slick runway at Teterboro Airport. Manhattan rose in the distance, familiar, magnificent, and unforgiving. Grace hadn't seen it since the night she left. Now, as the skyline came into view, her chest tightened with a mix of nostalgia and dread. The city didn't care who you were. It swallowed victories as quickly as it devoured failures. Inside the car, Ethan sat beside her, silent. The phone in his hand vibrated every few minutes, messages from lawyers, shareholders, journalists. But he didn't answer. His focus was elsewhere. "Are you sure about this?" Grace asked softly. He looked out the window, the reflection of skyscrapers passing over his face like ghosts. "I've spent years controlling every variable, every headline, and still, I lost control the moment I lost you. So, yes, I'm sure." She turned toward him, studying the profile she'd once known so well, the clean line of his jaw, the quiet intensity behind his eyes. He looked tired, but also lighter, as if some invisible weight had finally shifted. When they reached the building that bore his name, a crowd had already gathered. Cameras flashed like lightning, voices overlapping in a storm of questions. "Mr. Cole, is it true you're under federal investigation? Did your assistant help cover up illegal trades?" "Grace Miller, were you involved?" Ethan didn't flinch. He stepped forward, shielding Grace with his body, his hand briefly finding hers. "No comment," he said firmly, guiding her through the chaos and into the safety of the elevator. As the doors closed, she exhaled shakily. "They already think I'm guilty." He met her gaze. "Then let's show them the truth." That afternoon, the boardroom at Cole Industries filled with tension thick enough to cut through. The city's skyline loomed beyond the glass walls, a reminder of the power that once felt unshakable. Ethan stood at the head of the long oak table. Around him, shareholders murmured, their faces a mix of worry and accusation. The air buzzed with rumor. Victor Hale's name floated in the conversations like a curse. Grace sat at the side of the room, her laptop open, fingers poised, though her heart pounded too fast to type. Every eye that flicked toward her carried a silent question. Was she part of it? She tried to keep her breathing steady, but deep down, fear coiled tight in her stomach. She knew how fragile reputations were, how quickly truth could drown beneath the weight of speculation. Ethan tapped the table once, and the room fell silent. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice calm, deliberate. "I called this meeting because there's been confusion, dangerous confusion about what's happening within this company." He paused, scanning the room. "Let me make something clear. I built Cole Industries with integrity, and I intend to keep it that way." Someone at the far end, a man from the finance division, leaned forward. "Integrity, Mr. Cole. There are documents showing irregular trades under your name." Ethan nodded. "There are, and I can tell you exactly who forged them." He turned, gesturing toward the screen behind him. "Victor Hale, my former partner, the man I trusted more than anyone." A murmur rippled through the room. Grace watched as Ethan clicked through the slides, revealing copies of transactions, timestamps, correspondence, each piece connecting Victor to the scheme. His presentation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was precise, relentless, the work of a man who'd rebuilt truth from rubble. "Victor used insider knowledge to manipulate our shares." Ethan continued. "When I refused to cover it up, he leaked falsified evidence. He wanted to destroy me." He paused, his voice lowering. "And when that wasn't enough, he went after someone innocent." His eyes shifted to Grace. The room turned with him. Cameras clicked. She froze. "She was my assistant," he said, "and she's the reason any of this company still stands. They used her name to destroy my credibility, to make me doubt the one person who never deserved it." Grace's throat tightened. She hadn't expected him to defend her, not here, not in front of them all. Ethan placed both hands on the table, leaning forward. "They used you to destroy me," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "But this time, they'll see who we really are." The words hung in the air like a vow. For a moment, the room was silent, so silent that even the hum of the city below seemed to fade. Then the tide shifted. One of the older shareholders cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole, if you can prove this, we'll stand behind you." Ethan nodded once. "You'll have everything by morning." He stepped back, signaling the end of the meeting. The board members rose, some whispering, some avoiding eye contact. Grace remained seated, her hands trembling slightly over the keyboard. When the room finally emptied, Ethan walked toward her. The hard edges of his confidence softened as he stopped beside her chair. "You didn't have to defend me," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied, "I did." For a long moment, they stood in silence. Outside, the sun had dipped low, painting the city in gold and shadow. Grace looked out the window, her reflection overlapping his. In the glass, two figures side by side, both changed by the storm they'd survived. She wasn't sure what would come next, scandal, redemption, or something in between, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. Ethan followed her gaze, his expression unreadable but certain. "We're not done yet," he said softly. "But this time, we fight together." And in that quiet moment, as the last light faded across the skyline, she believed him. By morning, the city was already humming with rumor. News anchors spoke his name with careful neutrality, while headlines pulsed across screens in elevators and taxis. Coal Industries in turmoil. CEO to address press today. Grace watched from the window of the car as they drove downtown. The streets looked the same as they always had, busy, indifferent, but she could feel the weight of eyes everywhere. It wasn't just Ethan's reputation on the line anymore. It was hers too. He sat beside her in silence, one hand resting on a folder thick with documents. The other, loosely clenched, betrayed the tension he was trying to hide. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Ethan turned toward her. There were faint circles under his eyes from another sleepless night. "I've been ready for a long time," he said. "Just not like this." She hesitated. "You don't have to mention me. Ethan. If you distance yourself now, you might—" He cut her off gently. "I'm done pretending distance fixes anything." The car stopped in front of Cole Tower. A crowd had already gathered: reporters, cameras, curious onlookers. Flashes erupted the moment Ethan stepped out, the air buzzing with questions. "Mr. Cole, are you admitting guilt? Who's the woman with you? Is it true you paid her off?" He ignored them all. Grace kept her head down, following him inside through a side entrance, her pulse quickening with every step. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt endless. When the doors opened, the sound of voices hit them: 100 journalists, camera crews, and the low murmur of anticipation. The press conference was set in the main boardroom. Rows of cameras faced a long table draped in navy blue, microphones gleaming beneath bright lights. Ethan's legal team stood near the back, tense and alert. Grace could feel their worry ripple through the room. When Ethan walked to the podium, the noise died instantly. He paused, taking in the crowd, the cameras, the flashing lights. Then his voice, low, measured, and steady, filled the room. "Good morning. I know why you're all here. There's been speculation, accusations, and enough half-truths to drown the truth itself. I intend to change that." He opened the folder and placed a series of documents on the table in front of him. These are internal records emails, wire transfers, digital trails linking Victor Hale and several board members to a coordinated attempt at market manipulation. They forged my signature. They used my name. Murmurs swept the room. Cameras clicked. Ethan continued, unfazed. When I discovered what they'd done, I confronted Victor privately. He denied it. Days later, evidence began leaking, evidence designed to make me, and my assistant, look guilty. Grace stiffened at the mention. Ethan's voice didn't waver. "Miss Miller was dragged into this because she worked closely with me, but she had nothing to do with any of it. She was a victim, just as I was." A journalist called out, "Do you have proof?" Ethan nodded once. "Everything will be released to the authorities by noon today. Transparency is the only way forward." He clicked a button on the remote, and a projection screen behind him came alive with a series of financial records and timestamps. He explained each one clearly, piece by piece, weaving a story that was both technical and human, a story of betrayal and greed. For a moment, it seemed like the tide was turning. Then the door at the back of the room opened. Victor Hale walked in. The crowd erupted with noise, questions, gasps, the chaotic rhythm of breaking news. He strode to the front, flanked by 2 lawyers, his expression confident and cold. "Impressive presentation," Victor said smoothly, "but I think you forgot to include the full picture." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be here." "Oh, but I should," Victor replied, signaling to his assistant. "You're not the only one who brought evidence." A video began playing on the screen behind them. At first, it looked like standard office footage: Grace in Ethan's office, handling papers, signing documents. Then audio kicked in, snippets of conversation, clipped and distorted. "I'll make sure the transfer goes through. Ethan doesn't have to know." The crowd gasped. Cameras swung toward Grace. She went pale, her breath catching in her throat. "That's a lie," Ethan snapped, stepping forward. Victor spread his hands. "Really? It's your voice, Miss Miller, and your signature." Grace shook her head, stunned. "It's edited, it's not real," but the damage was done. The room buzzed with murmurs, whispers, doubt. The journalist leaned forward, ready to pounce. Ethan turned, his voice cutting through the noise like thunder. "That's a lie." The room froze. He pointed toward the screen, his expression fierce. "That recording is fake. They used fragments of real meetings and twisted them. She's the only one who ever believed in me when no one else did." The last words came quieter, but they carried further than any microphone could. For a long moment, no one moved, even the camera shutters stilled. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to stay upright, the weight of his defense sinking deep into her heart. Victor's composure slipped for the briefest second, his jaw tightening. "That's touching, Ethan, truly. But sentiment doesn't win cases." "Maybe not," Ethan said, straightening. "But truth does. And you've just shown everyone how afraid of it you are." The silence that followed was electric. Every camera in the room focused on him. Every journalist leaned forward, hungry for the next headline, but no one spoke. Then, one by one, the flashes began again, bright and blinding. Grace blinked against the light, her tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. She didn't look at the reporters. She looked at Ethan standing tall, unguarded, his confession still hanging in the air like a vow. The noise returned, questions shouted, names called, the frantic hum of news breaking in real time, but Grace heard none of it. Her mind was still caught in his words. "She's the only one who ever believed in me." It wasn't a defense. It was a declaration. As security moved to escort them out, Ethan turned to her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She tried to smile, but it wavered. "You just told the whole world about me." He gave a small, tired smile. It was about time they knew who really mattered. The doors closed behind them, sealing out the noise, the flashes, the chaos. Inside the empty hallway, the air was still. Grace leaned against the wall, trying to steady herself. Ethan stood a few feet away, watching her not as the woman caught in his storm, but as the one who'd somehow become his anchor. For the first time since everything began, she didn't feel invisible. And though the world outside was burning with headlines and speculation, in that quiet moment between them, there was something stronger than fear, something beginning to feel like truth. The next morning, New York woke to chaos. Every television screen, every news feed, every whisper in every coffee shop carried the same story. Coal industries under fire. CEO defends suspected accomplice in live press conference. It was as if the city had turned on them overnight. Stock tickers bled red. Investors pulled back. The empire Ethan Cole had built brick by brick, number by number, began to tremble. Inside the glass tower that bore his name, the air was electric with panic. Assistants rushed between offices, lawyers barked orders into phones, and reporters camped outside like vultures waiting for the next wound to open. Ethan stood in his office, looking out over the skyline he once ruled. The morning light glinted off the buildings, cold and impersonal. From this height, the city looked fragile like something made of glass, waiting to shatter. Harris entered quietly, a stack of papers in hand. "The board's meeting in an hour," he said. "They want answers." Ethan didn't turn. "They want a scapegoat," he murmured. Harris hesitated. "You know they'll suspend you, at least temporarily. They need to show the public they're taking control." Ethan finally looked away from the window. "Let them?" His voice was calm, but something in it had changed like steel that had been heated too long and lost its edge. "What about Grace?" Harris asked. Ethan's jaw tightened. "She's not to be mentioned. Not in statements, not in meetings, not at all." Harris nodded once and left. When the door closed, Ethan exhaled slowly, pressing his palms against the cool glass of the window. Below, traffic pulsed like a restless heartbeat. The city moved on, indifferent to his fall. He thought of Grace, her pale face under the flash of cameras, the way her voice had trembled when she said, "You just told the whole world about me." He had wanted to protect her, and, somehow, he had done the opposite. Across the city, Grace sat alone in a small rented apartment, the kind where walls carried every sound from the neighbors. The television flickered on mute, showing Ethan's face again and again, his press conference replayed, dissected, criticized. She turned it off. The room went silent except for the rain tapping against the window. New York rain was different from Portland rain. It didn't soothe, it accused. She couldn't stay. Not here. Not when every news outlet painted her as the woman who'd ruined a billionaire. By noon, she packed a small suitcase. Just the essentials: clothes, her passport, the worn notebook she still carried from her secretary days. She left the keys on the counter and slipped out into the gray afternoon. At the train station, she bought a one-way ticket to the coast. No destination in mind, just distance. As the train pulled away, she watched the skyline shrink behind her. It wasn't relief, she felt it was sorrow, deep and quiet. She had come to this city full of ambition once. Now she was leaving it with nothing but the echo of a man's voice saying, "You were the only one who ever believed in me." Back at Cole Tower, the boardroom was filled with tension thick enough to choke on. "We can't sustain this," one of the directors said sharply. "The media's relentless, and investors are calling for blood." Ethan sat at the head of the table, expression unreadable. "You'll have your blood," he said. "Mine?" There was a murmur of confusion. "I'll step back," he continued. "Effective immediately. The company needs stability. That means removing the face of the scandal." "Ethan," another voice said carefully, "we can fight this." He raised a hand. "No, you'll fight it. I'm done being the story." And just like that, the man who once commanded boardrooms with a glance stood, straightened his suit jacket, and walked out without looking back. That night, the storm rolled in again. Thunder rumbled over the skyline like a warning. Ethan sat alone in his penthouse, the one overlooking Central Park. The lights of the city glittered below, cold and distant. His reflection stared back at him from the glass-tired, hollow, human. He poured himself a drink, but didn't touch it. The glass sat heavy in his hand as he spoke softly to the empty room. "I built empires out of steel and glass," he said, voice rough. "But the only thing I couldn't protect was her." The words hung there, honest and unflinching. He thought about the years spent chasing control, how every success had been another layer of armor. He'd mistaken power for safety, strategy for meaning, but love had never obeyed his rules. It had demanded something he didn't know how to give: vulnerability, trust, surrender. Now it was gone. He stood, walking to the window. The storm raged outside, wind slamming against the glass like it wanted in. Somewhere out there, Grace was moving further away, and he didn't even know where to look for her. For a man who had always known what to do next, that was the cruelest punishment of all. He sank into the chair by the window, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. The city lights blurred through the rain. In the distance, a flash of lightning illuminated the skyline. The empire he had built now, trembling under the weight of silence. In that fragile glow, he realized something. No business school, no fortune, no power could teach winning had never been the point. Not if it meant losing the only person who had ever seen the man behind the name. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, in a coastal town where the air smelled of salt and wind, Grace stood at the edge of the water, watching the tide roll in. The storm clouds stretched above her, but she didn't move. She let the rain fall across her face, eyes closed, heart raw but beating. For the first time, there was no one left to save, no schedules to manage, no empire to hold together, just herself, behind her. The ocean roared. Ahead, the horizon blurred into gray. She didn't know if Ethan would ever find her again, but she whispered his name anyway, soft, like a prayer the wind might carry. And somewhere in the storm, as lightning split the sky over New York, he looked up from the glass tower that bore his name and felt it, the faint, impossible pulse of something that refused to die. The morning after the storm broke, the city seemed quieter than usual, as if even New York needed a moment to breathe. Ethan didn't show up at the office. The board released a statement announcing his temporary leave, a gentle phrase that softened what it really was, a fall from power. Grace never read the statement. She was already gone. The train had carried her north through the night, across miles of coastline that shimmered silver in the moonlight. When she stepped off at a small station hours later, the air tasted different, cleaner, salted by the ocean. The place hadn't changed much since she was a child. Same narrow streets lined with maple trees. Same old diner with a crooked neon sign. Same rhythm of waves greeting the shore like an old friend. Home. She hadn't said the word in years. Her mother's house stood at the edge of town, white paint peeling, porch creaking in the same familiar spots. Grace didn't go there right away. Instead, she walked down to the beach, where morning fog rolled in thick and slow. The horizon disappeared into gray, and for a while, she felt invisible again, but this time, it didn't hurt. She took off her shoes, letting the cold sand cling to her feet. The tide came and went in gentle whispers. The waves didn't ask her who she used to be or what she'd lost. They just existed endless, patient, forgiving. That was her first lesson in peace. Silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it's healing in disguise. A week later, Grace found work at the town library. It was small, 3 rooms, a cracked bell over the door, and a window seat that caught the best morning light. The smell of old books, coffee, and sea air became her new kind of comfort. She liked the stillness there, the soft hum of the heater, the rustle of pages, the occasional laughter of school children coming in for story hour. No reporters, no headlines, no reminders of who she had been in the city. Each morning, she'd unlock the doors, dust the shelves, and arrange stacks of returned books. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't powerful, but it was hers. Sometimes, she would pause to stare out the window at the ocean beyond the town square. The tide moved with a rhythm that matched her breathing, steady, certain, endless. She began to realize that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live alongside what hurt. Her mother came by one afternoon with a basket of muffins and that look only mothers have, the one that sees everything without asking. "You're quieter than you used to be," she said softly. Grace smiled faintly. "I think I ran out of noise." Her mother squeezed her hand. "Good. The world's loud enough as it is." They sat together for a while, not speaking much, the kind of silence that only love can hold. Later that evening, when Grace closed the library, she found a small envelope slipped under the door. No return address, but she knew the handwriting instantly clean, deliberate, familiar. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Grace, I don't know where you are, but I hope this finds you somewhere safe, somewhere quiet. I wanted to say thank you for believing in me when no one else did, and for reminding me what it means to be human. When the world turned its back, you stayed, even when I didn't deserve it. I don't expect forgiveness, but I promise you, this I'll find my way back to you. E." The paper smelled faintly of cedar and rain, as if it had been written on a night like the ones they used to share in silence. Grace pressed the letter to her chest, eyes filling with tears she hadn't allowed herself before. It wasn't the grand apology the world might have expected from Ethan Cole, the billionaire fallen from grace. It was something simpler, something real. She sat by the window, watching the mist drift in from the sea. The gulls cried in the distance, the tide rising and falling like a heartbeat. "I'll find my way back to you," she whispered, repeating the words, tasting their ache and their promise. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. Forgiveness was a journey, not a moment. And though her heart softened, her feet still needed time to stand on their own again. Weeks turned into months. The town began to feel like a second skin. She planted herbs in pots on her windowsill, learned the names of the regulars at the library, and sometimes volunteered at the local school to read stories to the children. Each day she grew a little quieter, but in the best possible way. Every now and then, a stranger passing through town would mention Ethan Cole's name, his quiet cooperation with federal investigators, the company's slow recovery under new leadership, the way he'd all but disappeared from public life. Grace listened without reacting. She knew he was rebuilding not his empire, but himself. And maybe, in a way, so was she. One crisp morning in late autumn, she walked to the edge of the beach again. The air smelled of pine and salt, the sky a soft watercolor of gold and gray. She carried Ethan's letter with her, folded and worn from being read too many times. She sat on a weathered bench overlooking the water, her coat pulled close around her. The waves rolled in and out like a promise she was finally beginning to understand. For a long time, She had defined herself by who she was to someone else, an assistant, a caretaker, a shadow. But here, in this quiet town by the sea, she was learning something new. She was learning how to be Grace Miller, simply and completely. She unfolded the letter one last time, smiling through tears. When the world turned its back, you stayed. She whispered the words again, but this time, they didn't sound like they belonged to him. They sounded like something she had finally learned to say to herself. You stayed, even when everything fell apart, even when it hurt, even when love became loss. You stayed. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and cedar. Grace closed her eyes, letting the sound of the waves fill the spaces where pain used to live. She didn't know what the future held, whether Ethan would ever find her again, or if fate would give them another chance. But she knew this: the tide always returned, and when it did, it brought with it a quiet kind of hope. As the morning fog lifted, Grace stood, slipping the letter into her coat pocket. She turned toward town, toward the life she was still building, step by step, day by day. Behind her, the sea murmured its endless song, soft, forgiving, eternal. And for the first time in a very long time, Grace smiled without sadness. Winter came quietly that year, wrapping the coast in soft gray skies and the sound of distant waves. Grace had learned to live by the rhythm of small things, the smell of coffee in the morning, the laughter of children at the library, the simple peace of turning a page without hurry. The scars inside her had begun to heal, not because she forgot, but because she'd stopped reopening them. And far away, in the restless heart of New York, Ethan Cole was learning to do the same, only his path to peace was paved with reckoning. After months of silence, the truth finally found its way to light. Ethan had never stopped searching for it. It began with a single document, a trail of encrypted transactions he discovered hidden in the company's old archives. From there, he followed the evidence across continents, through lawyers, ex-employees, and offshore accounts. Every piece led back to one name, Victor Hale. The man who had once been his partner had built his empire on deceit. But this time, Ethan didn't fight with anger. He fought with purpose. He had nothing left to lose except the truth itself. It took weeks of coordination, long nights, and the kind of patience that only comes from loss. When he finally gathered everything, Ethan called a press conference, not for the sake of redemption, but for closure. The room was smaller than before, the crowd quieter. The city had moved on to newer scandals, newer faces. But when he stepped to the podium, cameras still flashed, and every lens turned toward him. "I'm not here to rebuild my name," he began, his voice even calm. "I'm here to set the record straight." He laid out the evidence with the precision of a man who'd spent his life studying structure. Every word, every file, every photograph revealed a story of betrayal, how Victor had manipulated the market, how he'd forged signatures, how he'd used others to shield himself. Then Ethan paused, his gaze steady on the reporters before him. "For years, I believed power protected truth," he said softly. "But I was wrong. Power only hides what we're afraid to face." He closed the folder. "The company doesn't need another king. It needs honesty. And that's something I can't give it from the top floor of a tower built on mistakes." The room fell silent. The microphones caught the faint tremor in his voice, the exhaustion beneath his steadiness. When he stepped down, a journalist called out, "Mr. Cole, are you resigning?" "Permanently." Ethan turned back, a faint smile touching his face. "I'm not resigning. I'm returning to the kind of life I should have been living all along." By nightfall, the headlines had changed again. Cole exposes. Hail the billionaire who walked away for love and truth. The words spread fast, across screens, across nations. But Ethan didn't read them. For the first time in years, he didn't care what the world thought. He had done what he came to do. He spent the rest of the day packing his office, the same one that had once defined him. The walls were still lined with awards, plaques, and frame magazine covers, all relics of a man who had once believed his worth lived in other people's opinions. When the last box was sealed, he looked out over the city one final time. The skyline stretched wide beneath him, beautiful and indifferent. Somewhere out there, beyond the noise and the towers, was peace, and he knew exactly where to find it. He left the city that night. The highway stretched ahead like a dark ribbon, wet with rain and streaked with reflections of passing lights. He drove for hours, through the hum of tires and the steady rhythm of windshield wipers. Each mile carried him further from the man he'd been. Sometimes he thought of Grace the way she used to hum softly when she worked, the way she listened more than she spoke, the quiet strength that had steadied him, even when he pretended not to notice. He wondered if she'd forgive him, not for the scandal, not for the chaos, but for not seeing her sooner. By dawn, the rain had lightened to a soft drizzle. He crossed the final bridge that led into the small coastal town she now called home. The streets were empty, the storefronts still dark. The smell of salt and pine drifted through the open window. Familiar somehow, as if he'd been here in dreams. He parked at the edge of a narrow road, just beyond a weathered wooden fence that overlooked the ocean. And there it was, the small white house with blue shutters, the garden lined with seashells, the faint glow of a lamp in the window. Grace's home. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the soft hum of rain on the hood. His hands gripped the steering wheel, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of everything that had led him here. He had stood on the world's highest stages, faced down boardrooms and scandals, and never once felt this kind of uncertainty. Finally, he stepped out of the car. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and clean. He pulled his coat tighter and walked slowly toward the house, each step echoing with a mixture of hope and repentance. The ocean stretched behind him, gray and endless, its waves rolling like memory. The smell of wet earth and sea filled the air. When he reached the porch, he hesitated, the rain dripping from his hair onto the wooden steps. Through the window, he saw her Grace sitting by the fire, a book open in her lap. The same calmness he'd always envied surrounded her still. For a moment, he couldn't move. He realized then that this quiet house, this woman who had rebuilt her life one fragile piece at a time, was what redemption really looked like. It wasn't applause or forgiveness. It was the courage to show up again, even when you no longer deserved to. He lifted his hand and knocked softly. Inside, Grace looked up, startled. The book slipped from her fingers, and when she opened the door, the years between them vanished with the rain. Ethan stood there, soaked to the bone, eyes weary but alive. "I told you I'd find my way back," he said quietly. The sound of the ocean filled the pause that followed, waves crashing against the shore like a heartbeat, finding its rhythm again. Grace didn't speak. She simply looked at him, at the man who had lost everything to finally understand what mattered. Behind them, the storm began to fade. The horizon lightened with the first pale glow of dawn, and for the first time in a long, long while, both of them felt the quiet, undeniable pull of something that had survived every distance, something like forgiveness, something like home. The rain had softened to a mist by the time Ethan reached her door. The ocean murmured behind him, waves rolling against the rocks in slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat that had waited too long. His coat clung to him, heavy with rain, his breath rising in faint clouds under the cold coastal air. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the soft glow of light spilling from the window. Inside, Grace moved quietly through her small home, unaware of the figure standing just beyond her porch. She'd been reading by the fire, though the words on the page had long since blurred. The night carried a restlessness she couldn't explain. She had felt it for hours now, an ache somewhere between memory and hope, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then came the knock, 3 gentle raps, careful, hesitant, familiar. She froze. No one ever knocked this late. Heart pounding, She walked to the door and opened it, and there he was. Ethan Cole, soaked, exhausted, and real in a way he hadn't been in her dreams. His hair was wet, his suit wrinkled, his eyes shadowed with the kind of weariness that comes only from too much fighting for power, for truth, for forgiveness, for her, for a heartbeat. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was alive, trembling with everything they hadn't said. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "Ethan?" He swallowed hard, rainwater tracing down his jaw. "Hi." The word was so small, so human. It broke something in her. She stepped back instinctively, unsure whether to let him in or to let herself feel again. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "I know," he replied, "but I didn't know where else to go." Her hands tightened on the edge of the door. "You came all this way." Why he hesitated, then said the simplest truth he knew, "Because I needed to see you. To tell you, I finally did what I should have done from the start." She frowned, searching his face. "And what's that I told the truth?" He said, "All of it. About Victor, about me, about us." Grace blinked, her throat tightening. "I heard," she whispered. "They're calling you the billionaire who walked away." He gave a faint, tired smile. For once, they got something right. The firelight from inside spilled across his face, softening the hard lines that power had once carved there. He looked different now, not untouchable, not invincible, just real. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he said, voice low. "I came because you were the only person who ever saw me without all the noise. And I ruined that." Grace shook her head. "You didn't ruin it. You just didn't know what to do with it." He exhaled, the sound almost a laugh, but too full of regret to be one. "You're right. I spent years building walls so high, I forgot what it felt like to have someone on the other side." Rain dripped from the edge of the roof. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and cedar. Grace looked down, her hands trembling. "You don't owe me anything, Ethan." His answer came without hesitation. "I owe you everything." She looked up then, and in his eyes, she saw the truth of it. The man who had once ruled skyscrapers now stood before her, stripped of everything but sincerity. "Grace," he said softly, taking a step closer. "When I lost the company, when the headlines turned ugly, I thought that was the worst of it. But it wasn't. The worst part was realizing I could face all of that and still not know who I was without you." She felt her eyes sting, her voice breaking as she spoke. "And what makes you think I'm still that person?" "Because you stayed," he said simply. "Even when you left, you stayed in every part of me that still knew how to care." The words landed like rain after a drought, quiet, steady, healing. Inside, the fire crackled, the light flickering across the room like an invitation. Grace took a slow breath, her heart warring with her caution. "You hurt me," she said finally. "I know. You made me doubt everything I was. I know that too." Her voice trembled. "And now you show up here, after all this time, and what you think a few words can fix that." He shook his head. "No, I don't want to fix it. I just want to face it with you. For once, I don't have an agenda. Grace, I'm not here to win. I'm here to mean it." For the first time, he let the silence stretch. He didn't move closer. He didn't plead. He just stood there, letting the truth breathe. Finally. She stepped forward, her eyes softened, though tears still shimmered there. "You always had the right words," she said. "You just used them on the wrong things." Ethan smiled faintly. "Then let me start over with fewer words." The wind stirred, carrying the sound of the sea. He looked at her with the quiet kind of hope that doesn't demand, only asks. "Can I come in?" he asked. The question hung there, simple, human. Everything. Grace's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer. Then, slowly, she nodded. Her voice came out soft but sure. "Yes." "Ethan, you can come in." He stepped forward, crossing the threshold with the caution of a man entering sacred ground. Water dripped from his coat onto the worn wooden floor, and for a heartbeat, they both laughed through the tears because after all the chaos, this was how life gave second chances quietly, without grand music, just two people in the sound of rain. Grace closed the door behind him, shutting out the storm. For a moment, they stood there in the warm light, unsure of what to say next. The fire crackled softly. The world outside melted into mist. Then she spoke first. "You look tired." "I am," he said. "But it's the good kind of tired, the kind that means you finally stopped running." Grace smiled through her tears. "Then maybe you should sit." He did. And she joined him, side by side, facing the fire like two travelers who had finally found their way back from the same long road. They didn't talk about the past that night, not all of it. At least, some stories didn't need retelling. Some wounds had already learned to speak in silence, and as the rain whispered against the windows, the house filled with something both fragile and eternal, not forgiveness, not yet love, but peace, the kind that comes when two souls finally stop fighting the truth of what they mean to each other. The morning after Ethan came back, the sea was quiet again, as if even the tide knew it was time to rest. Grace woke first. For a long moment, she simply lay there, listening to the faint rhythm of waves beyond the window, the steady breathing of the man who had once felt unreachable. The light spilling across the curtains was pale and tender, the kind that makes you believe in new beginnings. When she rose, Ethan stirred, blinking sleepily. "Is it morning already?" he murmured. She smiled. "It's been morning for a while." He watched her move around the small kitchen, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, her hands finding familiarity in the simple act of making coffee. It struck him how peaceful it all felt. No meetings, no headlines, no walls of glass between them and the world. Just the sound of the sea, the smell of salt and coffee, and the soft hum of a life being rebuilt. A year later, they still lived in that same town by the coast. What began as a place of escape had slowly become home. The White House with the blue shutters now looked different, not because it had changed, but because it was lived in. Ethan had repainted the porch himself one weekend, muttering about how uneven his brushstrokes were. Grace had laughed, handing him lemonade and calling it character. In the backyard, she planted rosemary and lavender, the kind that thrived in sea air. He built her a little bench beside the garden, where she liked to read in the afternoons while gulls drifted overhead. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined, but it was the one they'd learned to want. Together, they opened a small cafe on the edge of town, just off the boardwalk. They called it Horizon and Tide. The name was Grace's idea. "It's about balance," she'd said. "The horizon reminds you to dream, and the tide reminds you to come back to shore." The cafe wasn't fancy whitewashed walls, shelves lined with books people could borrow, the scent of espresso and cinnamon in the air. Locals loved it. Tourists found it by accident and stayed longer than they meant to. Every morning, Ethan brewed the coffee while Grace arranged fresh pastries in the display case. They had fallen into a rhythm, quiet, easy, dependable. Sometimes she caught him smiling at her over the counter, the same way he used to look at boardroom screens, focused, intent, but softer now, almost reverent. He'd traded spreadsheets for sourdough, contracts for conversations, and somehow it suited him. One afternoon, a regular named Mrs. Donnelly leaned across the counter and whispered to Grace, "Your husband, he's got the look of a man who finally figured out what matters." Grace had smiled, glancing toward Ethan as he wiped down a table, humming under his breath. "Yes," she said, "he did." On Sundays, they closed early and took long walks along the shore. Sometimes they talked about the past, not in regret, but as if it belonged to someone else. Other times, they said nothing at all, letting the rhythm of their footsteps in the ocean fill the space where words weren't needed. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the water in shades of gold, Ethan stopped to watch the waves. "I used to think love was supposed to fix you," he said quietly. Grace turned to him, her hair catching the light. And now, he smiled faintly. Now, I think it's about walking beside someone while they fix themselves. She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. That sounds like something you've learned the hard way. He chuckled. Everything worth learning. I did. Their life was made of small, perfect ordinaries. Breakfasts shared at the kitchen table, sunlight warming the wood, quiet laughter as they burned the first batch of muffins, notes left on the refrigerator in looping handwriting, gone for a walk. Be back before the tide turns. Sometimes Grace caught him staring out at the sea with that faraway look, the one that carried both peace and penance. And she'd let him have that silence, knowing some things never needed mending, they just needed time. For his part, Ethan still marveled at how much she could say without words. A hand on his arm when he grew restless, a glance that told him it was okay to stop chasing and just be. He often thought about the empire he once ruled, its towers of steel and glass, its noise and power. None of it had ever felt as real as the sound of her laughter echoing through their kitchen, or the sight of her sitting on the porch, reading as the wind tangled her hair. One rainy afternoon, business was slow at Horizon and Tide. Grace sat by the window, watching droplets race down the glass, while Ethan refilled her cup with tea. You ever miss it? She asked softly. The city, the noise. He considered the question for a long time before answering. Sometimes, he said, but then I remember what it cost. She looked at him. And was it worth it? Ethan smiled, not even close. The rain grew heavier outside, drumming against the roof in steady rhythm. Inside, the cafe glowed warm and golden, the kind of light that makes time feel slower. Grace reached across the table, brushing her fingers against his. We built something better, she said. He nodded. We built something honest. Later that evening, as they closed the cafe, Grace flipped the sign to see you tomorrow and lingered for a moment at the doorway. The smell of rain mixed with the scent of coffee and sea air. This place feels alive, she said softly. Ethan glanced around the tables, the shelves, the photographs of sunsets along the wall. It's not the place, he said. It's the people in it. She smiled, stepping into his arms. Then let's keep filling it with stories, with laughter, with second chances. He held her a little tighter, the ocean's murmur steady behind them. We will. That night, as the waves whispered against the shore outside their window, Grace thought about how far they had come, not just in distance, but in grace. Once upon a time, they had been two people lost in ambition and silence. Now, they were partners in the quiet art of living. She turned toward him, whispering into the soft dark. Ethan, he stirred, half asleep. I think we finally made it. He smiled, eyes still closed. We didn't make it. Grace, we're making it every day. She laughed softly, her hand finding his beneath the covers. That's good enough for me. Outside, the tide rolled in and out, carrying with it the rhythm of a love not built to rescue, but to endure. Because in the end, love wasn't about saving someone. It was about standing beside them while they saved themselves. And in the small house by the sea, under a sky washed clean by years of storms, Ethan and Grace had finally learned how to do exactly that. The year had turned again. The air along the coast carried the scent of spring fresh salt, blooming wildflowers, the faint sweetness of new beginnings. The small town had long grown used to seeing Ethan and Grace together, walking hand in hand through the market on Sundays, laughing as they loaded boxes of pastries into the car for the cafe, sitting on the porch at dusk with 2 mugs of coffee and the comfort of shared silence. Their life had become a quiet rhythm, one that didn't need grand gestures to feel whole. Yet, sometimes, when the light fell just right across the ocean, Ethan would catch himself watching her with a kind of awe he still didn't fully understand. He had spent his life chasing everything money could buy, and yet the truest wealth he'd ever found was in her smile. One evening, as the sky deepened to violet and the tide whispered against the shore, he turned to her and said, Almost shyly, "I've been thinking." She glanced up from the book in her lap. "That usually means trouble." He smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe it means it's time." Time for what? He hesitated, then reached into his pocket. The ring wasn't extravagant, no diamonds, no elaborate design, just a simple band of silver, polished smooth by his own hands. Grace's breath caught. "Ethan." He took her hand gently. "We've both spent a lifetime learning what love isn't. Maybe it's time we promise what it is." The ocean murmured like a witness, soft and steady. She looked down at the ring, then back at him. "Are you sure you want this life?" "Ethan, it's small, ordinary." He shook his head slowly. "No, Grace, it's real. And that's all I ever wanted." The ceremony came a few weeks later, small, unannounced, perfectly simple, just the two of them, a handful of friends from the town, and the sound of the sea. They chose the beach at sunset. The cafe's wooden sign, horizon and tide, stood in the distance like a quiet blessing. Grace wore a soft linen dress the color of sand. Ethan wore a white shirt, sleeves rolled, no tie. The light wrapped them in gold. There was no music at first, just the hush of waves and the whisper of wind through the dune grass. Then, somewhere behind them, someone began to play a guitar, slow, tender, the kind of melody that makes you feel everything at once. Grace smiled through tears as she walked toward him, her bare feet sinking into the warm sand. Every step felt like a promise made long before either of them had spoken it aloud. When she reached him, Ethan took her hands. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat tightened with the weight of everything they'd been through, the mistakes, the losses, the quiet, patient forgiveness that had brought them here. "Finally," he said softly, "I once thought love was weakness. Now I know it's the only strength that lasts." The crowd, small as it was, fell silent, the sound of the sea rising to fill the pause. Grace's eyes shimmered. "And I once thought love was something you earned," she whispered. "But you taught me it's something you live. Every day." He smiled. "Then I promise to live it with you, and I promise to let you." She replied. Their laughter mingled with the music, light and genuine. The officiant spoke a few quiet words, the kind that didn't need embellishment, and when it was time, Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling just slightly. "I love you," he said simply. "I know," she replied, smiling through tears. "I always did." As they kissed, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in gold and amber. The waves rolled in gently, kissing the shore like a benediction. Someone cheered, someone laughed, and for a heartbeat, even the ocean seemed to applaud. Later, as the small group drifted back toward town, Ethan and Grace stayed behind. They walked along the water's edge, their footprints fading with each retreating wave. The air smelled of salt and cedar. The world felt impossibly still. Grace turned to him. "Do you ever think about what came before all of it? The chaos, the noise, the hurt?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Sometimes, but not the way I used to. It doesn't feel like pain anymore. It feels like proof. Proof that we made it through," he said. "That storms end, eventually." She smiled, tilting her head against his shoulder. "And what remains?" He looked out toward the horizon, where the last of the light shimmered over the water. "Peace," he said softly. Real, quiet, and eternal. As twilight deepened, the lights from horizon and tide flickered in the distance, warm and familiar. They could hear faint laughter from the cafe, friends cleaning up after the small celebration, music still playing somewhere inside. Ethan stopped and turned to face her. "Do you ever wonder how we got here?" Grace laughed. "Every day, but I don't question it. I just say thank you." He smiled, his gaze gentle. Then, "Let's keep saying it." The wind stirred her hair, carrying the scent of the sea. The world around them seemed to pause for one last moment, two souls standing where every storm had broken and every tide had begun again. Grace reached for his hand. "Come on," she said softly. let's go home." And as they walked back across the sand, the waves followed behind them, their rhythm eternal. The storyteller's voice would close the chapter here, steady, warm, filled with that rare stillness that only comes after long storms. For once, the storm had passed, and what remained was peace real, quiet, and eternal. Somewhere in the distance, a gull called, a door closed softly, the tide rolled in and out again, like breath, like life, like love, finally finding its rest. And on that stretch of coast, where everything had begun and ended and begun again, Ethan and Grace built what neither money nor ambition ever could, a home that lasted, a promise kept, and a love that finally felt like forever. As we look back on Grace and Ethan's journey, their story reminds us that love is never about ownership or pride, it's about presence. Sometimes, the most profound act of love is not in holding on, but in letting go long enough for two souls to truly see each other. Grace teaches us that self-worth isn't defined by how deeply we are needed, but by how bravely we choose ourselves when someone else cannot. Ethan reminds us that success means little if it costs us the people who make our hearts human. Power fades, wealth shifts, but kindness remains. Life has a way of stripping away what isn't real, leaving only what endures: compassion, forgiveness, and the quiet courage to start again. So, if you've ever walked away from someone who couldn't see your light, or if you've ever realized too late what truly mattered, remember this: it's never the end. Healing takes time, redemption takes humility, and love, when it's real, always finds its way back not to the past, but to the better version of who we've become, because peace isn't something we find in others. It's something we grow within ourselves and then share with the world. Thank you, dear friends, for sharing your time and hearts with us today. If Grace and Ethan's story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of love, forgiveness, or second chances, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Your support helps us keep bringing heartfelt tales that warm the soul and inspire the spirit. Until next time, take care of your heart and never stop believing in new beginnings.